Greg slammed his flat palm against the polished mahogany of the conference table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence of the Monday morning strategy meeting. "Stop," he barked, his eyes fixed on me with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Just stop typing, Tessa. The clicking is giving me a migraine, and frankly, looking at that blazer is making it worse." He pointed a manicured finger at my charcoal gray jacket. It was a perfectly functional piece of clothing I'd bought at a thrift store for $8 specifically for this role, but to Greg, it was an offense against humanity. "We have the new majority shareholder visiting this Friday," he sneered, looking around the room to ensure his sycophantic junior managers were laughing along. "And we are trying to project Fortune 500 excellence, not Goodwill bargain bin. If you can't afford to dress like a professional, maybe you shouldn't be sitting in a professional environment. Go sit in the back row. You're ruining the aesthetic of the room." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the sheer effort it took not to laugh in his face. I picked up my notepad and moved to the back of the room, sitting in a folding chair by the door. Greg smirked, satisfied that he'd put the temp in her place, and turned back to his PowerPoint presentation on synergistic efficiency. He had no idea that the Goodwill bargain bin blazer he just mocked was covering a heart that beat with the same blood as the man who built this building. He had no idea that the new majority shareholder, he was terrified of impressing, was currently sitting in the folding chair he just banished me to, taking detailed notes on his incompetence. Before I tell you exactly how I fired him in front of the entire executive board 4 days later, please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had a boss who judged you based on your appearance? I'm Tessa Thorne, and I'm 27 years old. Last week, I was a graphic designer living in a studio apartment. This week, I am the owner of Thorne Logistics, a company my grandfather, Elias Thorne, built from a single delivery truck into a global empire. My grandfather and I had a complicated relationship. My father had walked away from the family fortune to be a musician, a choice Elias never forgave. I grew up knowing I had a wealthy grandfather, but I rarely saw him. It wasn't until he got sick 6 months ago that he reached out. We spent his final months playing chess and talking about everything except business. He realized too late that the sharks he had hired to run his company were eating it alive. In his will, he bypassed the board, bypassed the executives, and left his controlling interest, 51% of the company, directly to me, but he left a letter with the will. "Tessa," it read, "don't walk in there as a thorn. They'll lie to you. Walk in as a nobody. See the truth, then clean house." So I did. The probate period gave me a 2-week window before the official transfer of power was announced. I contacted the CEO, Marcus Henderson, who was an old friend of Elias and the only person who knew the truth. We hatched a plan. I would enter the company as a temp in the data entry department under my middle name, Tessa Lynn. I dyed my blonde hair a mousy brown, bought a wardrobe of ill-fitting, second-hand clothes, and walked into the lion's den. My assignment was in the West Coast Operations Division, managed by Greg Miller. Greg was a corporate climber of the worst variety. He was 35, wore suits that cost more than my car, and treated anyone making less than 6 figures like furniture. In just 3 days as his temp, I had witnessed more HR violations than I could count. He stole credit for his team's ideas, he made the administrative assistant cry on a daily basis, and he padded his expense reports with client dinners that were clearly dates with his mistress. That Monday meeting was the beginning of the end. After banishing me to the back, Greg continued his presentation. "When the new owner arrives," he said, pacing the room like a caged tiger, "I want this department to look flawless. I want the numbers up. I want the desks clear. And for God's sake, I want the ugly people hidden in the server room." He laughed at his own joke. A few people chuckled nervously, terrified of his temper. "Rumor has it the heir is some estranged granddaughter," Greg scoffed. "Probably some trust fund brat who doesn't know a logistics manifest from a lunch menu. If we play our cards right, she'll be a silent partner. I'll dazzle her with the Q3 projections, she'll sign off on my promotion to VP, and she'll go back to buying ponies or whatever it is rich girls do." I wrote that down. "Thinks I buy ponies. Plans to manipulate me for VP promotion." The rest of the week was a masterclass in toxicity. Greg was in a panic. He had everyone working 12-hour days to prep for Friday. He made me retype 3 years of shipping logs because he didn't like the font they were originally saved in. "Arial implies laziness, Tessa," he lectured me, leaning over my desk with breath that smelled like expensive scotch and coffee. "We use Helvetica. It shows authority, but I wouldn't expect a temp to understand the psychology of leadership. I retyped the logs, and while I did, I accessed the raw data. See, Greg was so focused on fonts and suit jackets that he forgot that the temp doing his data entry had access to the actual numbers. I wasn't just typing, I was auditing. I found a discrepancy in the shipping vendor contracts. Greg had switched our local courier service to a company called Miller Transport 3 years ago. The rates were 20% higher than the market average. I did a quick public records search on my lunch break. Miller Transport was registered to a residential address, Greg's brother's address. He was funneling company money to his family through inflated vendor contracts. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. I printed the contracts. I printed the invoices. I printed the corporate registry for Miller Transport. I added them to a growing folder in my backpack, right next to my thrift store lunchbox. By Thursday, the tension in the office was suffocating. Greg was screaming at everyone. He fired a junior analyst because he brought him a latte with 2% milk instead of oat milk. I can't have dairy bloating me before the big meeting. Greg had screamed, throwing the cup into the trash can so hard it splattered on the wall. Get out, you're useless. I went to the bathroom and found the analyst, a sweet kid named David, hyperventilating by the sinks. I need this job, he was sobbing. My student loans, I can't lose this job. I handed him a paper towel. You haven't lost it, I said quietly. Just go home for the day, come back tomorrow, trust me. You don't understand, David said, wiping his eyes. Greg is the gatekeeper. If he says I'm gone, I'm gone. Greg isn't the gatekeeper, I said, a dangerous edge creeping into my voice. He's just the doorman, and he's about to be evicted. Friday morning arrived with the energy of an execution. The office was spotless. Greg had actually hired a cleaning crew to come in at 4:00 a.m. to shampoo the carpets. He was wearing a navy blue bespoke suit that probably cost $3,000. He had a fresh haircut. He looked like the picture of corporate success. I, on the other hand, wore the same charcoal gray blazer he hated, paired with a skirt that was slightly too long and scuffed flats. The new owner introduction meeting was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. in the main boardroom. All department heads and support staff were required to attend. At 9:45, Greg did a final inspection of the troops. He walked down the line of cubicles, critiquing ties and checking for dust. When he got to my desk, he stopped. Tessa, he sighed, massaging his temples. I thought I made myself clear on Monday. You are not to be seen today. I work here, Greg, I said, looking up from my monitor. The email said all staff. All essential staff, he hissed. You are a temp. You are a placeholder. And you are wearing that hideous jacket again. Do you have no shame? He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. Listen to me. You are going to go down to the archives in the basement. You are going to organize the files from 1998. You are going to stay there until I text you that the coast is clear. If I see your face upstairs while the new owner is here, I will personally ensure you never work in the city again. Do you understand? I looked him in the eye. I think I'll stay. I'm interested in meeting her. Greg's face turned a shade of purple I'd never seen before. You insubordinate little. He grabbed my arm. Get up, now. Unalignment her, Greg, a voice boomed from the doorway. We both turned. Standing there was Marcus Henderson, the CEO. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair, flanked by 2 people from legal and a very serious-looking security guard. Greg dropped my arm instantly, smoothing his jacket, his demeanor flipping from abuser to charmer in a split second. Marcus, Mr. Henderson, I was just correcting a personnel issue. We want everything perfect for Ms. Thorne's arrival. Marcus didn't look at Greg. He looked at me. He walked right past Greg, ignoring the hand Greg had extended for a handshake. He stopped in front of my desk. The room went silent. Everyone was watching. Greg looked confused, his eyes darting between Marcus and me. Ms. Thorne, Marcus said, his voice respectful and loud enough for the entire floor to hear. I apologize for the delay. The legal team needed a moment to finalize the transfer documents. Are you ready to assume command? Greg let out a sound that was half laugh, half choke. Marcus, I think there's a misunderstanding. This is Tessa. She's the temp, the data entry girl. The heir is. The heir, I said, standing up and cutting him off. I stripped off the cheap charcoal blazer, revealing a tailored black silk blouse underneath. I reached into my bag, not for a lunchbox, but for the thick file of documents I'd been compiling all week. The heir is the person you've been ordering to fetch coffee and hide in the basement for the last 5 days. I turned to look at Greg. The blood had drained from his face so completely that he looked like he was made of wax. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Tessa, he whispered. But you, the blazer. It's a thrift store find, Greg, I said, my voice projecting across the silent office. It cost $8, but you know what costs more? The 20% markup on the shipping contracts you signed with Miller Transport. I threw the file onto his desk. It landed with a heavy thud. I know about the embezzlement, I said, ticking the points off on my fingers. I know about the hostile work environment. I know you fired David yesterday because you didn't like his milk choice, and I know you think I buy ponies. Greg backed up, bumping into a filing cabinet. Miss Thorne, Tessa, please, it was a joke. The pony comment, I was just blowing off steam. I run a tight ship. Look at the numbers. I did look at the numbers, I said. I retyped them myself. Remember, you made me switch the font to Helvetica. And while I was doing that, I noticed you've been expensing your mistress's apartment rent as off-site storage. Gasps rippled through the room. The administrative assistant covered her mouth. That's a lie, Greg shouted, desperation taking over. She's a temp. She doesn't know what she's looking at. Marcus, you can't believe this. Marcus stepped forward. She's not a temp, Greg. She's the owner. She owns 51% of this building, this furniture, and your contract, which I believe she is about to terminate. I walked around the desk until I was standing toe-to-toe with him. He smelled of fear now, the scotch and cologne souring on his skin. You wanted to know if I have any shame? I said quietly. No, I don't, but you should. You treated people like dirt because you thought they didn't matter. You thought power gave you the right to be cruel. My grandfather built this company on respect. You have poisoned it. I looked at the security guard. Escort Mr. Miller out of the building. He is not to touch his computer. He is not to speak to anyone. He is to leave immediately. You can't do this, Greg screamed as the guard took his arm. I built this department. I'm the VP. You need me. I need a leader, I said. Not a bully in a $3,000 suit. You're fired, Greg, and don't worry about the reference. I'll write it myself. They dragged him out. He was still shouting about his rights and how unfair it was as they pulled him toward the elevators. When the doors closed, the silence in the room was absolute. Every eye was on me. I looked at the terrified faces of the staff, people who had been beaten down, marginalized, and terrified for years. I took a deep breath. David, I called out. David, the analyst who had been fired the day before, poked his head out from a cubicle where he had been packing his things. He looked terrified. Put your box down, I said. You're rehired, and you're getting a raise. In fact, everyone is getting a review, but not the kind Greg gave. We're going to fix this. We're going to make this a place where you don't have to hide in the basement just because you can't afford a designer suit. I picked up the charcoal blazer from my chair and put it back on. And for the record, I said, smoothing the lapels, I think this jacket looks just fine. Back to work, everyone. The applause started slowly, just one person, then another, until the whole floor was clapping. It wasn't polite corporate applause. It was the sound of relief. Greg Miller is currently facing a lawsuit for the embezzlement. He had to sell his expensive condo and his car to pay his legal fees. Last I heard, he was working at a car rental counter at the airport, wearing a polyester uniform that fits him poorly. I imagine he hates it. I run Thorne Logistics now. I still wear thrift store clothes sometimes, just to remind myself that the value of a person isn't in what they wear, but in what they do. And every time I hire a new manager, I tell them the story of the temp in the cheap suit. I tell them to be careful who they step on, because you never know who is really signing the checks. Thank you for listening. If you've ever had to deal with a toxic boss, hit that like button and share your story in the comments. And remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards. Subscribe for more stories of karma served cold.